The project you care about most is probably the one sitting untouched right now, not the laundry, not the emails, the thing that actually matters to you, the book, the business, the application, the conversation you've been meaning to have. And if you're being honest, you can't fully explain why you keep avoiding it, because on paper, it makes no sense. You want this, and you still aren't doing it. For decades, the explanation everyone reached for was laziness, or poor time management, or simply not wanting it badly enough. Those explanations feel true because procrastination looks like a scheduling failure from the outside. But researchers who've spent their careers studying this behavior have found something almost nobody expects. Procrastination has very little to do with time management. It has almost everything to do with emotion. And the more you care about something, the more likely you are to avoid it. Psychologist Tim Pychyl spent decades researching procrastination at Carleton University, and his central finding reframes the entire problem. Procrastination, he argued, isn't a failure to manage your schedule. It's a failure to manage a mood. Specifically, it's what happens when a task triggers a negative emotion, anxiety, boredom, self-doubt, frustration, and your brain reaches for the fastest available way to make that feeling go away. That fastest way is almost never doing the task. It's avoiding it. This reframes everything about why procrastination targets the things you care about most. A task that means nothing to you carries no emotional weight. Answering a routine email doesn't threaten your sense of who you are. But the project that actually matters, the one tied to your identity, your ambitions, your fear of finding out you're not as capable as you hoped, that task comes loaded with emotional risk the moment you sit down with it. The higher the stakes, the louder the anxiety, and the louder the anxiety, the stronger the pull to make it disappear. Here's the mechanism in practice. You open the document. Within seconds, some quiet, uncomfortable feeling rises. A flicker of doubt about whether you're good enough to pull this off. A fear of what happens if you try your best and it still isn't good enough. Your brain registers that discomfort as a problem to be solved immediately, and it has a solution sitting right there. Close the document, check your phone, reorganize your desk, do literally anything else. The moment you look away, the discomfort drops, relief floods in, and your brain quietly logs a lesson. Avoidance works. It just worked. Do that again next time this feeling shows up. Notice what's actually being avoided in that sequence. It was never the task itself, the typing, the sending, the dialing. Those are just physical motions, and physical motions alone rarely trigger this kind of resistance. What gets avoided is the moment of exposure that completing the task would create, the instant where a private hope turns into a public, checkable fact. As long as the task stays undone, the gap between who you hope you are and what you can actually prove stays comfortably unmeasured. Procrastination, seen this way, isn't really about the work at all. It's a strategy, mostly unconscious, for postponing the verdict. This is what researchers call negative reinforcement, and it's a far more powerful teacher than most people realize. You're not being rewarded for finishing the task. You're being rewarded for escaping the feeling the task produced. Every single time you avoid the hard thing and feel that wave of relief, you're training your brain, deepening a habit loop that has nothing to do with the actual content of the task and everything to do with emotional escape. It helps to understand why this loop is so hard to break once it forms. Negative reinforcement operates on what behavioral scientists call an intermittent schedule of relief, meaning the escape doesn't have to work every time to keep the habit alive. It just has to work often enough. Some days, avoidance genuinely buys you a calmer afternoon with no visible consequence at all, because the deadline was soft, or nobody noticed the delay. Those low-cost escapes are exactly the ones that cement the pattern most deeply, because your brain doesn't need a guaranteed reward to keep repeating a behavior. It just needs enough wins, scattered unpredictably through the losses. Psychologist Fuschia Sirois extended this idea with research she calls the mood repair hypothesis. Her studies found that procrastination functions as a short-term strategy for managing how you feel right now at the direct expense of your future self. In the moment, avoidance genuinely does repair your mood. You feel better almost instantly. But Sirois' research also found the long-term cost. Chronic procrastinators report significantly higher stress and lower well-being over time because the relief is never actually free. It's borrowed against a future version of you who now has less time, more pressure, and the exact same unresolved task waiting, except now it's also wrapped in guilt. That gap between present relief and future cost has a name in behavioral research: temporal discounting. Your brain is remarkably bad at weighing a real immediate feeling against a hypothetical future consequence. The anxiety you feel right now staring at the blank page is vivid and present. The stress you'll feel in 3 days when the deadline is looming is abstract, distant, easy for your brain to underweight. So your brain does the math badly on purpose, essentially, trading a large but distant cost for a small immediate reward. This isn't a character flaw. It's a basic feature of how human brains evaluate time, one that evolved in a world with far fewer long-range deadlines than the one you're living in now. Researcher Piers Steel spent years combining decades of procrastination studies into a single model he called the procrastination equation, and temporal discounting is one of its core ingredients, alongside how much you expect to succeed and how far away the deadline feels. His analysis of hundreds of studies found that procrastination rates have climbed steadily over recent decades, and the tasks most likely to trigger it share a specific profile: low expectation of immediate reward, high emotional discomfort, and a deadline distant enough for your brain to discount it into near irrelevance. Meaningful, ambitious projects check every one of those boxes almost by definition, which is exactly why they get avoided more, not less, than trivial ones. There's a reason this specific pattern targets meaningful work more than trivial work, and it circles back to something psychologists call the self-worth theory of motivation. If you never fully try at something, you preserve a comfortable ambiguity about your own ability. As long as the report is unfinished, you get to believe you could have written a brilliant one if you'd only had more time. The moment you actually finish it and put it out into the world, that protective ambiguity disappears. Now, there's evidence, one way or the other, about what you're capable of. For tasks tied closely to your identity and self-worth, unfinished can feel safer than evaluated, even when part of you desperately wants to be evaluated and to succeed. This explains something that confuses a lot of people about their own behavior: why procrastination often gets worse, not better, as a deadline approaches, right up until a different emotion, panic, finally overwhelms the original anxiety and forces action. That last-minute sprint isn't willpower kicking in. It's one strong emotion, fear of the consequences, finally outweighing another strong emotion, fear of evaluation. You didn't solve the procrastination. You just switched which feeling was driving. So if procrastination is fundamentally an emotional problem wearing the disguise of a scheduling problem, the traditional advice starts to make a lot more sense as to why it so often fails. Better planners, more detailed to-do lists, stricter deadlines, none of that addresses the actual mechanism, because none of it touches the emotion driving the avoidance in the first place. You can build the most detailed schedule in the world and still avoid the task, because the schedule was never the problem. The feeling was. Pychyl's research points towards something that sounds almost too simple to work. The goal isn't to feel ready or motivated before you start. It's to just begin, specifically because starting is what changes the emotional equation. Once you're a few minutes into the actual task, the anxious anticipation that was driving the avoidance often fades because the thing you were dreading turns out to be less threatening than the version your brain had constructed around it. This is sometimes called the just start principle, not because motivation doesn't matter, but because motivation tends to arrive after you begin, not before. There's also something worth sitting with in Sirois' research. Self-compassion, not self-discipline, predicts lower procrastination over time. People who forgive themselves for procrastinating in the past are less likely to procrastinate again. That finding runs against almost everyone's instinct. The natural response to catching yourself avoiding something important is to pile on guilt and self-criticism, as if shame will finally motivate you where nothing else has. But shame adds another negative emotion to the pile you're already avoiding, which means it usually deepens the avoidance instead of ending it. Self-compassion, oddly enough, removes some of the emotional weight the task was carrying, which makes it a little easier to approach. Sirois has also documented what this cycle looks like when it repeats over months and years rather than single afternoons. Chronic procrastinators in her studies didn't just report more stress in the moment of avoidance, They reported a slow accumulation of what she describes as a kind of low-grade guilt that sits in the background of everything, a persistent sense of falling short that has nothing to do with any single missed deadline and everything to do with the pattern itself. That background guilt becomes its own source of the very discomfort the avoidance was originally trying to escape, which is part of why the cycle tends to deepen rather than resolve on its own without some kind of deliberate intervention. Which brings this back to the thing you're avoiding right now. It probably isn't unfinished because you don't care. It's probably unfinished because you care too much, and somewhere underneath the delay is a feeling you haven't quite let yourself name. Not laziness, not bad time management, just a mind trying, in the only way it currently knows how, to protect you from a discomfort that was never actually as dangerous as it felt. The project you care about most is still sitting there. It was never really about the task. It was always about the feeling standing in front of it.